In George's 4th year, Blackmere's entrance hall had not known stillness in some time. Preparations for the afternoon's excursion into the village had overtaken nearly every available surface nearest the front doors, including the chairs now buried beneath coats and scarves. Somewhere among them rested one of Sophie Wentworth's shoes, removed, I suspected, for no greater reason than someone had asked her to keep it on. Unbothered by George's increasing grimness as he struggled with the buttons of her coat, Cyril's daughter only bounced harder upon her heels while he attempted to keep hold of both her and his patience. "Stand still," he said. With the typical defiance of a little girl her age, Sophie only laughed and redoubled her efforts towards making George's task more difficult. I confess I found the entire exchange highly entertaining myself, if only because every man eventually discovers this particular battle is unwinnable, no matter how early he begins training for it. Mary Margaret slept against my shoulder through the commotion, undisturbed by any of it. Even so, Nurse Baxter watched me with the sort of stern attention that suggested she trusted no one alive to hold my daughter properly except herself, which, in fairness, was precisely why I'd hired her. Grace looked up from her handbag just in time to catch George attempting once again to fasten Sophie's coat before she escaped him. "She is not one of your toy soldiers, my love," she said. "Be more gentle." "She will catch cold," George answered without once looking up from his work. Once the coat had been secured to his satisfaction, George caught hold of Sophie's hand before she might vanish elsewhere within the house. The arrangement appeared perfectly acceptable to Sophie, largely because she seemed convinced George existed only for her personal entertainment. A throat clearing came from the main hall, and I looked up to find Langsley lifting one finger politely to interrupt us. "Mr. Eckert from Brighton is on the telephone for you, sir." Though life at Blackmere had not entirely settled again after the births and funerals of these last few years, the house had at least begun finding its proper order once more. Most of the legal affairs surrounding the estate's transfer to Lady Blackmere had been concluded. George rarely attempted to injure himself daily, and for the first time in longer than I cared to calculate, I had begun spending more of my days with my family than away from them, which meant interruptions upon that time had grown considerably less welcome than they once were. Unfortunately, the telephone call from Brighton arrived at an extraordinarily inconvenient moment, especially since I had spent the better part of a week waiting for it. Realizing I was now single-handedly delaying the entire household from leaving, I shifted Mary Margaret against my arm and turned towards Grace, intending to pass the child over so I could deal with the matter. But before Grace could take the baby from me, Cyril stepped forward instead and held out his arms towards me first. He had worn a thoroughly self-satisfied expression these last weeks that left me a bit suspicious that Sophie Wentworth would not remain an only child much longer. "Let us have her a moment," he said, motioning towards his wife. "I ought to brush up my skills while they are still fresh in my mind." By then, George had already begun ushering Sophie towards the front doors before she discovered some new opportunity for disaster, so I backed further towards the hall myself and motioned Cyril after them as well. "Go on outside before the children become any more restless," I said. "I might be a few minutes." The walk towards the study proved just long enough to indulge the thought again. Truthfully, I had never possessed much desire to spend unnecessary time away from Blackmere itself. Most places disappointed me, while home rarely did. Still, the estate became heavy at times in ways difficult to explain to anyone who had not spent their life responsible for a thing so old and sprawling. There always remained another tenant issue, another repair, another account, another obligation waiting somewhere within the walls, and though I did not resent the work of it, I had begun seeing increasing value these last months in the notion of occasionally escaping it altogether for a time with Grace and the children. So I had spent the better part of these last weeks quietly arranging, in my mind, summers on the coast with them all. And the more I considered the picture of it, the more I found myself wanting it rather badly indeed. Provided the conversation with Mr. Eckert went in my favour, I simply could not wait to see the look upon their faces when I told them what I'd done. I drew the study door shut behind me before crossing towards the desk, where the receiver had already been left waiting for me. "Yes, Mr. Eckert," I said as I reached for the nearest pen. "I am very glad to hear from you finally." The conversation had scarcely begun when the unmistakable sound of children's laughter drifted through the open window. There truly existed nothing else upon this earth that sounded quite like a child's joyous laughter, which meant some expensive article of clothing had likely just been ruined somewhere upon the grounds. So I backed slowly towards the window and pulled the curtain aside, while Mr. Eckert continued discussing figures and contracts against my ear. Below, George had apparently rediscovered the fountain. Water splashed hard across the stone towards Sophie while she clapped her hands and laughed loudly enough for half the county to notice. "I had hoped to remain somewhat beneath that budget, if possible," I said, while George struck the water again for her benefit. Sophie's laughter rang clear across the grounds afterward, followed shortly by George's own when she splashed him back hard enough to soak the front of his coat. And quite suddenly, I found I didn't much care what the property cost at all, because if purchasing that house meant more years of this for them, more summers, more laughter, more memories with Grace and the children while they were still small enough to want such things from me, then the price of it would be worth every pound. "Though I confess, I do prefer that property above the others," I said, "so how do we make this happen?" Another splash from the fountain sent Sophie stumbling to her bottom on the stone afterward, though before Grace or Sarah could so much as move towards her, George had already reached her first. He pulled her upright again and gathered her tightly against him to comfort her, and I admit, I found myself hoping he had learned that much from me at least. "Yes," I said, "I believe we have a deal, Mr. Eckert. Send the contracts over to Blackmere, and I shall have the funds transferred by the end of the week." I set the receiver back into its cradle and glanced towards the fountain once again before turning from the window to leave. And as I closed the study door on my way out, I thought how very fortunate they were to grow up children of the same water as Grace and me.